I'm talking with the composer Christopher Cerrone, who is one of my favorites by far of composers, and mostly because of your vocal music, because I was a former singer myself, so I'm attracted to that immediately. And I'm really fascinated by your treatment and the uniqueness of the text that you've chosen for this piece. It's called Beaufort Scales, and I wonder if you can tell people who don't know, what is the Beaufort Scale?
That's a great question. I did not know at one point. So it is a measure of wind force on land and sea. It is still the current measurement that the government uses, and it comes back to the early 19th century, and an explorer named Sir Francis Beaufort uh, created the scale as a kind of meteorological study. What's unique and really interesting about this, unlike many other measurements of other sort of weather phenomenon, is this one happens to be unusually gorgeous. The text is beautiful and it's sort of transfixing. It reads like poetry. So I had this idea to make a piece that would set this scale to music.
How did you discover the Beaufort scale to begin with?
I feel sort of terrible about this because it was a friend who suggested that I make an opera about it. And I was like, not sure that we really need a whole opera about this, but I do love the scale itself. And so I just sort of took the idea from the person who is a lovely person. I feel kind of bad about it. But I just wanted that one scale, and I held on to it for years. I have like a collection of texts that I or different ideas for pieces I kind of keep in my notes app on my phone, and so when Beth Willer proposed, wanted me to propose a piece to her for a commission, I thought this idea of this kind of like female voices, um, electronics, and I think the thing I had sort of had this interest in exploring weather phenomenon as a kind of analogy for climate change, and I felt like I didn't want something to be too on the nose or too obvious or preachy, and instead of sort of being like this is real, this is bad, whatever, it's just sort of not really interesting to me from an artistic perspective. I wanted to do something that was just like, let's sit here and experience what different kind of weather phenomena are like. Like, let's have the immersion of weather. And that's all I felt like the piece needed in that regard.
Yeah. Can you talk about the text in a little more detail? I mean, there are two things going on here. You have the titles of the pieces and the singers singing phrases by Francis Beaufort, but you also have other texts that are spoken in the
Yeah.
course of the piece. Yeah.
Yes. And so I thought it was a bit monomaniacal to only write, just to chant weather patterns for 35 minutes. It seemed a bit monotonous to me. And so, I should say the other thing that really appealed to me about the text is obviously the kind of formal nature of it, is that the weather proceeds, step zero is calm, see like a mirror. The last is, the air is filled with foam and spray, see white with driving spray, and so there's just this, widespread devastation. And so you just have this kind of natural architecture to the work, very calm, gradually gets more and more intense. And so that was kind of a wonderful thing for me because the architecture, the structure of the work was built in. But I realized that actually, honestly, that this idea of just continuous acceleration of intensity is perhaps a bit one dimensional. And so I instead inserted these interludes. And each has an interlude from a sort of favorite piece of literature, a favorite writer of mine, but that sort of would have some kind of text about weather. And so earlier on, there's a interlude about by F. Scott Fitzgerald from The Great Gatsby that describes a very placid, just slight, you know, um, disturbance in the weather until Melville and Moby Dick talking about two different storms, and Carson talking about a rainstorm. And so each of these interludes starts completely spoken, and so there's a structure of intensity that builds up, but there's also these four interludes, and each of those one by one gets more and more intense. So the first interlude is entirely spoken, the second interlude is spoken by two singers with some electronic processing, and the third and fourth are actually have a lot of singing in them as well. So I kind of wanted to have a little micro drama within the other scales where even the interludes have a kind of increasing of intensity in one way or the other. And so that was my idea of kind of breaking up the kind of relentless one-dimensional nature of the structure into, allowing for moments of commentary.
Well, I have a confession to make. When I was first listening to the recording, I skipped to the last track to see what all the hubbub was. Now I want to go through your phone, definitely. And
Yeah,
listen
well,
to it.
like it's like I feel like in my like all my favorite TV shows of kind of classic nature of like The Sopranos or The Wire, the penultimate episode is always the one where the real tumult happens, and then the last episode is a kind of summing up or a coda. And so actually the last step is sort of it's disturbing, but it's actually not crazy. The steps 10 and 11 are absolutely wild. And then that this is like, okay, we are beyond, this is after the end of the world. And so there's a kind of eerie calm to it, actually.
But you mentioned Beth Willer, who is founder and director of the Lorelei Ensemble. What's your history with them, and how did this commission come about?
I think my earlier piece, The Branch Will Not Break, which I think I think we talked about it a few years back, a choir and chamber orchestra piece, was recommended to her by a mutual friend, and she really loved that piece. And I think so she was interested in performing that at some point in her kind of capacity as a choir professor. And but then Lorelei is her group that she founded, and so I think she really wanted a piece for Lorelei. There's really not enough hefty. There are not a lot of hefty pieces just for high voices. There's lots of SATB, not a lot of SA. And so that was an opportunity to write a large scale piece. And I think the other thing he was interested in was, doing a piece of electronics for the ensemble. So that was another exciting thing for them.
Yeah, can you talk about that electronic track? I assume that you composed that also.
I did.
What did you do to write that?
Well, there's two layers of electronics. There's a kind of pre-existing continuum of track, tape as we called it in the old days. And then there's live processing of the voices. So the voices are transformed in real time in a performance. And so there's a mixture of both. There's different, and my idea for the piece was that as the piece got more and more intense, the voices get more and more distorted. And so there was kind of a little by little, the voices become more and more, early on in the piece is kind of these, more euphonous loops and it's like a bed of sound, a bed of lush sound as we're sitting on the beach in these small waves that are coming crashing along versus the end, things are much more distorted. And I think the idea was to sort of, suggest without insisting that most likely the increased use of technology in our life probably has something to do with the amount of uncannily disturbed weather that we experience. And so again, I found it very important to not be preachy, but certainly it's my experience, and I think that is probably not, I'm probably not the only one.
Yeah. Let's have a conversation about your approach to writing for voices. Now, the text obviously is a driver of that, but do you think of a particular way to write for the voice as opposed to writing for instruments? How do you assemble that together?
Absolutely. And it's funny because I just wrote an essay about this piece because first of all, that, dealing with text writing for voices, I mean, you could see I'm a literary guy, I'm married to a writer. And like, it's funny, I have the Ned Rorem reader right here, one of the great vocal composers. So I'm always thinking about, how to deal with text. But I think one of the most important things is to be respectful and for the music to emerge from the text somehow to and I think in the case of my prior works, setting a poem or setting a libretto is a little bit easier because you're sort of just following the text. In the case of this piece, because there's so little text, the text had to become not just the melody but also the accompaniment had to become everything. And so I really had to dig into the true meaning and even phonography, I guess would be, of the word. And so that, there's a kind of the second movement of the piece, the ripples movement, there's an effect on the voice which literally is like a ripple. And so this kind of delay, this slapback effect where it's like, and the idea of that was, of course, that the voice itself would become a ripple.
Mm.
because I wanted to, again, in this tradition that goes back to Monteverdi, to all these classic sort of great vocal composers, but to do it in a kind of 21st century way was to always proceed from the text, but then to kind of think about it. And there's another movement of the piece where it's like it's small waves becoming longer is the text. And so you have the singer singing small waves be, small waves become, small waves becoming, small waves becoming longer. And so you have this kind of literal musicalization of this wave becoming longer through the text setting process. So it's very, very important for me to have this kind of intensely close relationship between words and music. I just, for this piece, had to kind of extend that out in different ways, because there's just, it couldn't just be, write a melody based on this lovely poem.
Your word painting is spectacular in this piece, and I love the way that the voice integrates with the electronics. I mean, you're talking about, their voices are altered a little bit through electronic means. I didn't even notice that when I was listening to the recording because I was immediately drawn into the Christopher Cerrone sound world. I, I, do you have a specific idea in mind, like a toolbox of sorts when you come to composing, or is it something that you just do instinctively?
I have my little tricks that I'm up to. But I tried with this piece to do a lot of new things and to try to and so this is by far the most live effects I've done in a piece. Definitely used a few kind of favorite ideas, but maybe in a new way. And then there was a lot of new things for me in this piece as well, in terms of literally writing this ripples effects. There's interestingly an effect in my, I think we talked about my piece Liminal Highway a long time
Yeah.
ago. And there's an effect in that piece, which is a flute being run through a oil tanker. It's an effect called convolution reverb, which is literally the multiplication of A times B equals C. So like flute plus oil tanker equals flute in an oil tanker. And so this case, I wanted to sort of think about that idea again, but in a very different way. So I did voice plus water equals the Anne Carson interlude. And she says, the hotel is made of water, which is beautiful. The small hotel at Borgetta is made of water. And so literally what I do is I have the voice run multiplied by a sample of a recording I took of a fountain. And so you get this kind of aqueous, otherworldly sound of sustain. And that is literally, a voice and a water being merged, just the way her idea of the walls of the hotel and the hotel itself are made of water. And so, again, I've used my existing tricks, but perhaps in a new way.
Yeah. It's so interesting. And I've read the words that Francis Beaufort wrote for his scale, and it's
Yeah.
like he's invented a new kind of poetry because he's talking about very mundane things, but he's doing it in such a concise way, a short way, that he defaults to poetic language. I mean, it's a poetry of its own. Is
Yeah.
that part of the attraction for you?
Absolutely. I mean, it's like a haiku or something, right? Where,
Yeah.
you're left pondering the meaning far beyond when you've read it, and that was what was so appealing to me, and I also couldn't think of another composition that had done something like this. And so that was like, oh, I've seen a lot of composers set poetry. I've never seen a composer set, uh, weather intensity scales.
Yeah. Well, the phone book will be next.
Well,
Okay.
I'm getting all these scales now from people. One friend sent me uh, there's a cloud scale, like a thickness of clouds. It's actually quite beautiful. And then some other people have sent me scales with regards to bowel movements, and that one is. I don't think that one's going to make it to the corpus, but I appreciate people sending me all sorts of scales. But yeah, it's really I'm going to become the composer of scales of intensity.
Well, speaking of new things, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you're working on now, what the future holds for you, what commissions you have coming up.
Sure. Yeah. I just got off the phone with the wonderful Roomful of Teeth. And I'm writing actually, and this has completely happened by chance. So I just wrote the soprano, alto, mezzo ensemble, the high voice ensemble. They asked me to write for the guys of their ensemble, so I'm writing a piece for low voices now. Completely by chance that this all came together. And that piece is actually kind of interesting because it's quite different from this one. I think I had to naturally do something different, and that is based on recordings I've taken in Sicily of music around Easter, kind of Good Friday music. So there's kind of these laments around Good Friday, and the ensemble is sort of, and there's an incredible tradition of male vocal singing around Good Friday that sort of, especially in Sicily, merges the Arab Norman kind of cultural influence that is very prominent on that island. That there is this kind of mixture of East and West. It doesn't sound quite Eastern, it doesn't sound quite Western, it sounds Sicilian. And so that was quite remarkable. And so that's the project I'm working on right now that'll premiere this fall. I'm writing another piece for my good friends Hub New Music. They're an ensemble based in Boston-ish. And so I'm writing a big piece for them. And then yeah, there's sort of a long list of projects that are sort of emerging over the next few years. But a few orchestra pieces, I just wrote my first piece for winds, which was really fun. And I got to, write for a new combination of instruments. But yeah, lots of things always seem to be brewing around here.
Are you the kind of composer that can work on several things at once, or do the pieces you're working on spill into each other while you're writing them?
Generally not. I have like a couple of little tiny things here and there. I have a piece for quintet that's being made into a septet that'll premiere at the famous Sydney Opera House in Australia, and then another arrangement. So I am doing these little things here and there that I really would prefer not. Not that I really am happy to do them, but I prefer not to multitask. But when pressed, I can multitask, but I prefer not to. And I just wrote a new piece for this group called Vonk in the Netherlands, and that was a really fun project because I actually there was a budget to hire a poet, which I usually don't have. And so my friend Andres Serpa, amazing Puerto Rican American poet, also from New York, who I met years ago at the MacDowell colony, and he wrote me a poem for the project, which was really lovely. So that'll premiere in October as well. And that's been, in recent years, I think perhaps just out of trying to find ways to be inspired, I've moved away from setting more classic poetry and trying to find different kinds of texts that are somehow unique or different, or challenge me in new ways. Like I know how to set a poem pretty well at this point, so I'm immediately drawn to do something else.
Yeah. Is there anything else, getting back to Beaufort Scales, is there anything else that you think listeners should know before they go on this journey?
If you can, I think that if, I'm not just hawking my wares, I swear. I'll actually probably put the text on my website because it's almost all public domain. If you can find a way to listen, the CD comes with the literal text, and I believe the digital booklet does as well, that you can get on Bandcamp. I would say the ideal listening experience is to lock yourself in a room for 35 minutes and don't do anything else, because so much listening is really ambient these days, and this is euphonist, but I think the best experience you can have, and it can be a very intense one, is just to listen to the whole thing in one go, doing nothing else. And I think that will really be the ideal listening experience for the piece.
So we don't have time to play the whole thing right now, but if we were to go out on a track or two, do you have any suggestion?
I do. I would say that there are three that I would maybe suggest. The ripples, the step one of the second track of the piece. Then there's the small waves, it's steps 4 through 6. And then that's kind of euphonist, sonic, lovely. And then the steps 7, 8, and 9, which are the C heaps up, is really violent and exciting and dramatic. So those would be the three I would say are the good, like you'll get a good taste of the piece.
Great. Christopher Cerrone is the composer of Beaufort Scales, featuring the Lorelei Ensemble. It's out from Cold Blue Music. And people can visit you online at your name, right? .com.
ChristopherCerrone.com. Absolutely.
All right, we'll put that in the bottom of this video conversation.
Cool.
Thank you so much for talking about this.
Thank you, Brad. It was really nice to see you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.